I was saving it to the local computer, not to the cloud. Okay, here we go. Starting the webinar. Okay, we're going live. And let's see.
Okay, let's just give everyone a few minutes to come into the room. I actually can't see myself how many people we have. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, there are 9, 10, 13, 14. Yeah, they're filing in.
Okay, so let's just give it a minute or two.
I'm signing off.
Okay, I haven't seen anyone new trickle in for about 10, 15 seconds or so. So, oh, they just did. But I guess we'll go ahead and get started. So first, in case you don't know me, I'd like to introduce myself. So I am Christopher Bennett. I'm currently acting as the current chair of the Astrochemistry subdivision of the ACS. If you're not familiar with that website, the link I'm just putting into the chat. Oh, hold on a second. Apparently I can't link that to I can't chat to the audience apparently. So I've put it in as a link to the panelists. If someone else who can actually forward that along, that'd be great. Yes, I'm the current chair. Kyle Crabtree is serving as the past chair. He's at UCS Davis. The chair-elect who's going to take over after me is Michelle Nuevo at NASA Ames. And then the vice chair who'll be taking over after Michelle is Jamie Ursula Cook, who is at NASA Goddard. And David Woon is acting as the secretary. And before I get on to the current event of today, I just want to also briefly announce again that we are still accepting nominations for the outstanding PhD thesis. So applications are due March 1st. So we're extending that deadline until March 1st. And the winner will receive a $500 prize. And we're trying to also organize another second $500 prize for the travel award. And so if you want the direct link to those details, hopefully someone can paste that link there as well for me. Okay. As I said, so this year we're actually having some grad students are organizing all of the seminars. Today we are currently joined by Kate Gold and Catherine Walker and Chisholm Dim. And I don't know if Athena Flint joined us yet, but I'll basically just hand it over to you guys to take over from here. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Kate Gold. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a third-year graduate student in chemistry at the University of Arizona. I work under Lucy Zuris, and I do observational work on evolved stars. Catherine, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so my name's Catherine. I'm a third-year PhD student in chemistry. I use any pronouns. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, working under Professor Susanna Wittges-Weaver. And I'm interested in astrochemistry, particularly in with lab astrochemistry and star formation. Maybe Chisholm next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chisholm Lim. I'm a third-year PhD candidate at the University of California, Davis, and I work under the supervision of Dr. Kyle Crabtree. And my research is pretty much structural characterization of some cyclic nitrogen-containing molecules and some nitrogen heterocyclic radicals that have, some of which have some astrochemical relevance. Yeah.
And I'm Athena Flint. I'm a third-year grad student at the University of Mississippi, working for Dr. Ryan Fortenberry. And most of my work is involved with computational astrochemistry, usually high accuracy of grain precursors.
Yeah, we're very excited to lead these. We're hosting fairly frequently about these monthly graduate student-led seminar events through the ACS astrochemistry subdivision. We really want to highlight the astrochemistry research that's going on, and with a special emphasis on graduate student research, early career professionals, and those who have more experience that can then support the graduate students and postdocs with their experience. And so this also gives us an opportunity to connect between conferences and also share some personal aspects that we don't always get to at conferences. So personal life experiences, career paths, etc., as we'll have today. And so we're very excited. I believe Catherine has a few more updates, but we're very excited for today's talk.
Yep. So briefly, I just wanted to mention some of our upcoming speakers and upcoming AstroCheminars. Our next AstroCheminar will be on March 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll have some talks from some grad students or early career folks. Tentatively, we're thinking it's going to be Chisholm and Athena. So keep an eye out for more info on that. There will also be a talk by Dr. Jose Cernacharo on April 10th. And we want to have some other grad student and early career talks in May. So with that being said, please, if you're interested in giving a talk or if you have other ideas for our these sorts of events, please email us, contact us directly.
Great. So today I want to introduce Dr. Abbott Lyon, who is the Director of Research and Development and Strategic Initiatives at Kennesaw State University within the Office of Research. She assists faculty in finding funding, developing, delivering grant writing workshops, various kinds of internal funding, and strategizing research initiatives for her university. Additionally, she thinks about research agenda overall and having effective research development and administration. Dr. Abbott Lyon joined the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at KSU in 2011, now tenured and promoted to associate professor as of 2018. She's taught over 3,000 students and trained over 50 undergraduates, and as well as 5 master's students in her research lab, where she studies the chemistry of phosphorus-bearing minerals, including schreibersite, metal phosphites, etc., and their role in astrobiology and the origin of life. This work includes a variety of analytical techniques and ultra-high vacuum equipment. We are delighted that amidst her busy schedule, she is able to join us today. Her talk is titled "Stay Curious, Be Resilient, and Adapt When Necessary," a message that can benefit us all.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. And I'm delighted to be here to talk to you all today. I want to say that I'm going to tell you a story about my research path with the purpose of sort of giving you some ideas about what you might consider as you walk through your career path. But please feel free to interrupt. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat. If you I've presented fairly regularly at ACS meetings, so a lot of what I have to say today may be familiar, and I'm not like bent on giving you a science talk necessarily. I'd really rather share some of my expertise in terms of things you can do to be well prepared to move forward in a career, and to take what you're doing in graduate school and think about what you want to do beyond that, or in your postdoc, depending on what stage you're in. So I decided that I would start with the slide that I show my students on the first day of class. So this is the slide I use to introduce myself when I'm teaching Gen Chem or PChem or AstroChem. And the idea is to help students understand what my background is, why I am qualified to be teaching their class, but also to give them some idea about the fact that I am a human being, right? I have a family, I have 10-year-old twins, which is why I don't generally respond to messages from students between 4:30 and 8:30 p.m. And I've been really fortunate to have a pretty diverse research path. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today and sort of what I got from those experiences and also how that's led into my faculty position at Kennesaw State. And I love this quote by Carl Sagan. It's part of my research website homepage, which is that I really do think that for me, science changes the way I think about things. And that's been one of the most important aspects of my career. Okay, so I started as an undergrad at Emory University, and I double majored in classical studies, which is the study of ancient Greek and Rome, and in chemistry. And so I actually did 2 different undergrad research projects. One was using DFT to look at an organometallic complex, and the other was scraping red pigments off of artifacts in the Michael C. Carlos Museum and analyzing them using X-ray diffraction and FTIR. And it was a really, I had a really unique opportunity to do some experiment and some theory, and also to sort of think about science in terms of different kinds of applications. So in terms of, sort of industrial catalysis applications, and also in terms of something that was a lot more about artistic representation and how do we think about the world that we live in. And so I went on from my undergraduate studies at Emory to the University of Virginia, where I was lucky enough to be part of an NSF-funded IGERT. So this is an integrative graduate education research traineeship program. The idea is that it was an interdisciplinary collection of faculty from physics and chemistry and chemical engineering and engineering physics. And we were all basically related to each other in the fact that we were looking at how lasers interacted with matter. And that was a small piece of my PhD, sort of modeling photochemical reactions of gas-solid interactions. Most of what I did was using a transition state theory to look at gas-solid interactions. I was the only theoretical chemist in a group of experimentalists. And I was mostly using a semi-empirical model to study experimental data. So this graph on the right, this figure on the right is showing you the lines are the theoretical predictions and the points are the experiments. And so I spent hours and hours combing through experimental papers, trying to extract the parameters I needed to be able to successfully model the data. I got really good at understanding what experimentalists didn't think was important, but was really important from my perspective as a theoretician, to be able to model those systems effectively. And so at the end of my PhD, I was looking at postdoctoral positions, and I made the choice to try to pursue postdocs in experiment, in part because while I really liked the theory that I was doing, I recognized that I was highly dependent on experimental data that I couldn't generate for myself. And I decided it wasn't a very smart career move to be sitting around waiting for other people to get me the data I needed to do my research. And so I moved to Berlin for 2 years. So I was very fortunate to have an Alexander von Humboldt postdoctoral fellowship. I worked at the Fritz Haber Institute, which is one of the Max Planck institutes. We used to joke that everything was coated in gold, which was partially because our catalytic cells were actually gold coated to make them inert so that we could study the catalytic samples we were interested in, but also because they were very well funded. And one of the reasons this was such a good opportunity for me is because there was a lot of technical support. So each research group had a technician. There was an electronics shop right there. There was a machine shop right there. We had close collaborations with theoreticians. And so I did a lot in terms of really beefing up my understanding of experiments, especially ultra high vacuum. The PhD group I worked with, I was definitely the extra set of hands. So I already knew a lot about UHV systems, but it is different to be the person they go grab when they need someone to reach their hand through a port and like hold this wire for a minute versus the person who's running the instrument from day to day. And so I really learned a lot during this postdoc. And then I ended up coming back to the US and doing a second postdoc. So I basically did the equivalent of 2 PhDs, one in theory, one in experiment. When I joined Tom Orlando's group at Georgia Tech, he had funding through a NASA Astrobiology Institute. And so my first project was looking at prebiotic chemistry on the surface, sort of modeling Titan's surface. And so I learned to use time of flight mass spectrometers, to do electron irradiation. This was really my first introduction to ICEs. And up until this point in my career, I'd mostly studied catalytic systems, like industrial catalyst systems. So methane decomposition, methanol conversion to formaldehyde. But in this case, I was really looking at planetary science systems. And so I spent a lot of time during this postdoc teaching myself astrochemistry and planetary science because that was not my background. I did get to use some of my expertise from my PhD though. There was a faculty member at Georgia Tech still there, Nick Hudd, who's very interested in origin of life chemistry and in particular in formamide. And we did a transition state theory paper looking at decomposition pathways of formamide. So let's get to the meat of it. In 2008, I was living in Germany and I applied for faculty positions and a few other research scientist positions. There was an economic downturn and about a third of the searches I applied for ended up being canceled. But in reality, I got one phone interview, which is frankly pitiful and very much an indication of the fact that I did not know what I was doing. And I see a hand raised, so I'm happy to take a question. That's on purpose or by accident. Katerina, did you want to ask something? Maybe not. You can always drop it in the chat too. So in 2010, I once again went on the academic job market. This was after I had moved back to Georgia Tech. I applied for 14 faculty positions and another position that was a permanent position. And at that time, I managed to get 7 on-campus interviews, 3 written offers and 2 verbal offers. Those statistics are really different. And one of the reasons I like to talk to early career individuals is because I learned so much in those 2 years about what it took to get a job. And reflecting on it, the things that made the biggest difference, one of which was that I went to the American Chemical Society's postdoc to faculty workshop. I do not know if this is something they still have. I was actually in the first cohort that got to do it. It was right before the fall national meeting, and I learned so much. But the most important things I learned were really the differences between different types of institutions, of academic institutions, and what they were looking for in an application packet. And the other thing that was really important about this is that after going to that workshop, I took some time to really think about what my strengths were and what I wanted to do, right? As a PhD student, I had worked at an R1 and that was basically what I knew. And what I learned was that it's a lot broader than that. So you may all already be familiar with a lot of this, but if you're not, as a faculty member, my job pretty much consists of doing work in 3 separate areas. So one is scholarship and creative activity is what we call it at Kennesaw State, but it's basically your research. Another is teaching, supervision, and mentoring. So that includes teaching in the classroom and the lab, but also training research students, whether those are undergrads or grad students. And then that third category is labeled professional service, which is something you'll notice in all of these charts shows up as 10% of your workload, but rarely only takes 10% of your time in a faculty position. And while no matter what kind of tenure track faculty position you go into, you're going to have these 3 workload areas, how much time you spend in each area is very dependent on the kind of institution you go to. So many of you, did a PhD, you probably did it in an R1, right? This is a research intensive institution where faculty members spend the bulk of their time doing research. Now, it does vary from institution to institution how much time they need to spend teaching, but generally 20% of your workload would mean you teach 2 classes a year, so maybe 1 per semester. On the other side, you'll see a pie chart that says PUI, or primarily undergraduate institutions. These are often places where teaching is the dominant amount of time that instructors spend, right? And so 60% being in teaching might mean that you're teaching 3 courses in the fall and another 3 courses in the spring or something similar to that. You're still spending a considerable amount of time on research. There's pretty much always an expectation for scholarship and creative activity if you're tenure track faculty at an institution. But the way your time is divided is very different. And that's also reflected in what search committees are looking for when you're applying for jobs. So at an R1, your research plan is probably the most important piece of your application and the portions of your CV that really reflect your research expertise. So your publications, your presentations, if you've written proposals for fellowships, for example, those things carry the most weight. if you're applying for a position at a primarily undergraduate institution, they're going to pay attention to those research plans, but they're also going to focus largely on what you say in your teaching philosophy and how well prepared to teach students you seem. And that's an important thing to be considering when you're writing your applications, because if you're not giving enough care and thought to your teaching philosophy and you're applying for a job at a PUI, you're probably not going to get a phone interview or an on-campus interview. I've added something in the middle here, which are ERIs, or emerging research institutions, and Kennesaw State University has become an ERI. These are places where there is very much a balance in expectations between teaching and research. In some cases, even if the research is very highly valued, there are still significant course loads in terms of teaching. And so you really have to figure out how you're going to balance the 2 classes a semester you have to teach with the research expectations. And that can be a really challenging situation, but it can also be a really fun situation, especially if you enjoy teaching, which I very much do. It can be really nice to be at a place like that. When I was applying for jobs the second time, I had a pretty good handle on this, and I had decided that for the most part, I was going to target ERIs and PUIs, places where teaching was more highly valued. And actually, I had a rule of thumb that if they didn't ask for a teaching philosophy, I wasn't going to apply for the job, because it seemed like they didn't have enough of a value placed on teaching for me, for what I wanted to be able to do. There were 2 things I did that I think helped me convert applications into job offers. And one was having a really detailed plan for my research agenda. I had had some time to really think about this, and I was applying for places where I knew there wasn't necessarily as much infrastructure support. And so I was very sort of savvy in how I laid out my plan. I built a lot on what I had already developed in terms of skills from my PhD and my postdocs. I intentionally outlined collaborations that I was going to work on in the beginning of my career when I knew I would be building my lab and it would take some time to get up and get going. I will be clear, this is the agenda I proposed, not the agenda I necessarily did. There are some aspects of this that I did, but it was a plan. And I think having a plan that was well thought out, even if search committees recognized that they didn't think I was going to achieve the plan I was laying out, I think having a plan that seemed very well thought out and had some flexibility built in was really important. The second thing that I think really helped me was actually having a very detailed plan for my research funding. Okay, so I'm going to say 2 things about this. One is that this is a completely unrealistic plan for the places that I was applying, probably. I don't know why I thought I was going to get 5 grant proposals written in my first year as a new faculty member. But it didn't really matter the time that I said I was going to do this. The point was that I knew when all the deadlines were, I knew what the opportunities were, and I was thinking about the possibilities for my research. So I had an agenda, I had an idea about what I wanted to do, and I knew that there were multiple ways that I could get there. And part of what I was going to do my first couple of years as a new faculty member was really test out the landscape and see which funding mechanisms seemed like they were going to be the best fit. And so I was considering, major federal funding agencies, primarily NASA and NSF. I was also considering private foundations that I knew would be smaller pots of money, but that also might be easier for me to get. So places like the Research Corporation for the Advancement of Science and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. And now a big part of my job is actually helping faculty find funding. And so I'm quite good at finding opportunities, and I'm happy to talk more to this group about how you go about doing that. But I think my willingness to sort of explore and not just be like, oh, I'm going to target chemical structure dynamics and mechanisms from NSF. And if that doesn't work out, I guess I have no plan B, right? Like I had lots of options. I was like, I have a skill set. I've done a whole bunch of different things in terms of theory and experiment and different kind of techniques. And I've worked with different people, and I'm going to maximize my potential to get the resources I need to be successful with my research using that diverse background that I've built. So I got 7 interviews. And I did not get an offer from Washington University. It was pretty clear that that was an R1 that was very focused on research. And while they valued teaching, I think we both mutually agreed that probably wasn't a good fit. I also interviewed to be the managing director of the Center for Chemical Evolution. And I did not get an offer. I was super excited about Marshall University. But the reality is that I was part of a 2-body problem, and that seemed like it was going to be untenable in terms of making that situation work. And then I was left with 4 other places where I was thinking about the balance between teaching and research, my ability to actually do the research there, and my ability to get funding. And so I ended up deciding that Georgia Gwinnett probably didn't have the infrastructure I needed to do the research that I wanted to do, and that Michigan Tech was maybe, I wasn't their first choice, but they were willing to, they were a little desperate, I'm going to be honest, and that didn't feel like the best plan. So it really came down to Kennesaw State versus the University of Southern Mississippi. And I really liked the University of Southern Mississippi. There were a few things, however, that I was worried about. And one of the conversations I had was with a program officer, actually, about what they thought the prospect of getting funding at University of South Mississippi versus Kennesaw State might be. And one of the things that was really hard is that an emerging research institution, or an institution that's sort of on the border between an R1 and R2, sometimes can be harder to compete for funding because you have a PhD program and you are trying to go after the same money as institutions that have much more well-developed offices of research to help you, and they have much more infrastructure, and your startup package is significantly bigger. And at Kennesaw State University, yes, I was going to be largely working with undergraduates, but I was going to be very close to my postdoctoral advisor. And I was going to be able to, from my perspective, be seen more as a collaborator as opposed to competition, which was something I was mindful of. And the other thing was that I had personal reasons to stay in the Atlanta area. And so Kennesaw State ended up winning out. I will say that I did not know about EPSCoR funding. And if you don't know about it, it is something to be mindful of. Certain states in the United States don't have as much federal funding, have special funding opportunities that they can apply for. Those tend to be less competitive. And so it turns out Mississippi isn't an EPSCoR state. And in some ways, that can actually make it easier to get funding than being in a place like Georgia, which is not an EPSCoR state. So there are trade-offs. And no matter what path you choose, just know that you're going to make the best choice you can with the information you have on hand. And hindsight is always 2020. It's easier to say, oh, in retrospect. But I was really excited to come to Kennesaw State, right? It's a rapidly growing comprehensive university. When I started here in 2011, it was the 3rd largest university in Georgia, and we had about 21,000 full-time students and 2,000 graduate students. I will tell you that this fall, we enrolled more than 45,000 students. So KSU has more than doubled since I became a faculty member here in 2011. KSU was highly successful with undergraduate research when I got here, and we had a considerable amount of infrastructure in place. The College of Science and Math had been really successful with major research instrumentation grants. And these pictures on the bottom, the building on the left is sort of the original building, but on the right was a brand new building that they were blasting for when I was interviewing. So during my seminar, the room was shaking because they were blasting the bedrock to lay the foundation for the building. And there were a lot of faculty who had success in getting funding for undergraduate research. So there was a number of mentors on campus who could really help me figure out how to write compelling proposals and what kind of funding mechanisms I could be going for. I also, as I said, Tom Orlando at Georgia Tech was my postdoc advisor, and we talked a lot about the potential for me to collaborate. To this day, I do not own a spot welder for my lab. We drive to Georgia Tech if we have to spot weld something, which we fortunately do not have to do all the time, but occasionally. And I had some personal reasons for staying in the Atlanta area, which really did influence my decision. Okay, so what's it like to come to a university that's not an R1 and build a lab? It does vary depending on the university. I will be very honest, my startup package was $42,000 plus access to an FTIR. And I built an ultra high vacuum chamber with that. That is kind of unheard of. I had a lot of people who didn't think I could do it. But I was pretty savvy about the way I built it. I knew what was absolutely necessary to get. And one of the things I did was build small. So my first vacuum chamber was all centered around a 2 3/4 inch cube. And I also begged and borrowed equipment from people in Georgia. So I went to UGA and I went to Georgia Tech and I said, what vacuum components are you not using? Because everybody's got a junk drawer in their lab, right? And a shout out to John Stickney at UGA. He was amazing. He was a little skeptical at first, but he started offering me components and got like really excited because I was so happy to get whatever. And it was just sitting in his lab, not doing anything. And so I actually built my chamber around a mini chamber that had all these funky ports off of it that he happened to have lying around and they weren't using it for anything. I also figured out how to get used and refurbished equipment, which helped me build a lab for low cost. And I don't think TFS Technologies is still operating, but Dunaway Stockroom Corp is a great resource for that. They do a lot of refurbished equipment and those guys are fabulous. They always work with me. I think I've only bought one new turbo pump in my entire career. The rest of them have been refurbed pumps that have worked really well. And I shopped around for new equipment a lot. There was a time in my life where I could tell you exactly how much a 10-pack of copper gaskets, 2 3/4 inch diameter would cost you and shipping from like 7 different companies. So I made my startup work for me. And you know, there are a lot of things. In this picture on the right, you can see this was one of my first research students, Victoria Norwell. We literally came in with a saw and cut the resin tops and stacked the original parts of the chamber on boxes of paper until we got braces built to hold it in place. In the beginning, I went after mostly foundation grants. And these were really nice because they weren't huge pots of money, but they were easier to get in a lot of ways. And I basically tripled my startup within the first couple of years of being a faculty member. So through a Cottrell College Science Award and then an ACS PRF. Not all of these will be applicable to this community necessarily, but the point here is you don't necessarily have to start with big money, and sometimes getting a little bit of funding externally helps you build and show, you know, you can get some pilot data, you can show that you're successful, you can show that you're productive, and that can help you get larger pots of money. And then I actually did become part of the Center for Chemical Evolution. So I was not the managing director, but I was a scientific collaborator, co-PI within the center for 8 years. This really funded my research. Over the course of the time in the CCE, I brought in about $500,000 of research funding. I was able to build a brand new UHV chamber when we got renewed. I also got to assist in writing the renewal proposal, and that was a really beneficial experience to see how faculty from R1 sort of thought about center grants and the way that those are framed. During the last year of the CCE, I was invited to be part of the management team, which also taught me a lot about grant administration, something that I hadn't had experience with and might not be able to get experience with at a place like Kennesaw State otherwise. So I'm very grateful to Nick Hudd. He was a great mentor and really supported me over the years. So I'll tell you a little bit about the science I did. When I started, I was really focused on astrochemistry. That's what my Cottrell College Science Award was about. When I joined the Center for Chemical Evolution, I shifted a lot of my research focus into origin of life chemistry. And then when the CCE sunsetted, I sort of shifted back to astrobiology/astrochemistry. And so when I talk to students at Kennesaw State about my research, I sort of start by talking about these big picture questions, right? How did life arise on Earth, and could it exist elsewhere in the universe? Those are fundamental human questions that we want to know about. And then I say, we're not going to answer those questions, right? That's not what we're going to do in our research experience. We could think about how phosphate became incorporated into so many important biological molecules, right? If you think about it, The backbone of your DNA is made up of these phosphate-linked molecules, right? These phosphate groups that help your DNA stay soluble in water. Your cell membranes are made up of a phospholipid bilayer, right? That hydrophilic head has a very important phosphate group. The primary energy currency molecule in your cells, right? The coenzyme ATP, adenosine triphosphate, right? Phosphate is really important. And it turns out that it primarily had to come from rocks. So if we think about the biogenic elements, things like hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen, those all tend to exist in a volatile phase, right? As gas phase molecules or a liquid with a high vapor pressure. But phosphorus doesn't have something like that. Phosphine is not something that's easily produced that we know of a source in the universe or on the early Earth where it would have been abundant. And so phosphorus is coming out of rocks. And so if you are a surface chemist like me, if your training is primarily in surface chemistry, then this is a great question, right? How do you get phosphorus out of rocks and into a phase that you can use for biology? And so this is what my group has been focused on. And over the years, we've really been looking at what phosphorus-bearing minerals were likely the most important on the early Earth and in extraterrestrial environments. Under what conditions can you get these minerals to release their phosphorus? And then what are the primary phosphorus-containing molecules that you produce, right? What's the primary way that it comes out of these rocks? So we have an ultra-high vacuum chamber. We do a lot of other analytical techniques as well. One of the things in my career that we've done is really looked at what's available where I am that we can use. So we also do a lot of SEM-EDX, so scanning electron microscopy. We also do NMR in my lab. So we sort of use the instrumentation that's available. But this is a nice top-down photo of my UHV chamber. It doesn't have the cryo head in this picture, but we do have a cryo head. We can get down to right now, we're getting down to about 90 Kelvin. With some differences with the sample holder, we can get down to about 50. And we have an infrared reflection technique that we do on the surfaces in vacuum. And then we also have a little quadrupole mass spectrometer. So we can look at desorbing gases from our surface. And so we can really think about structure-reactivity relationships. There are three main types of phosphorus-containing minerals that my group has looked at over the years. The first is schreibersite. This is an iron nickel phosphide. It's kind of an unusual material. It's found in meteorites. In many ways, it resembles a metal alloy, but technically it's a semiconductor. And in schreibersite, phosphorus is in a slightly negative to neutral oxidation state. On the other end of the spectrum, you have phosphate minerals like hydroxyapatite. These tend to be found in meteorites that have undergone aqueous alteration and Stody meteorites. It is the most common form. Phosphates are the most common form in biological systems. The phosphorus there is in a +5 or fully oxidized state. And then in the middle are metal phosphites. This is a potentially important intermediate species. They're relatively soluble in water, so they could have biological implications. And the oxidation state being in a +3 means they're susceptible to oxidation and reduction, as well as being able to engage in acid-base chemistry. So we spent some time in my lab looking at how to make schreibersite. In the first 2 years at Kennesaw State, most of my time was spent figuring out how to build the UHV system and get it working properly, and figuring out how to take this powdery stuff that is not sticky, so to say, and make it into a highly polished surface that you can then reflect infrared light off of to look at it. It was not an easy process, and you can see that it was not a perfect process. So we get good distribution of nickel and iron, but there was pocketing for the phosphorus, right? There's some phosphorus depletion, and this image on the left, I love and hate because there's a giant crack in the sample. We used it anyway, but it does definitely influence the chemistry, right? In this region, it will be different than on the surface, but our infrared technique is a surface average technique, and you really can't see what's in the crack using infrared. So you just have to be careful about how you interpret the desorption data in the mass spec. We also learned to make metal phosphites because sadly you cannot buy them. And I have a great collaborator at the University of South Florida, Matt Pasek, who worked with us on this. And I'll just point out on this slide that phosphites are sort of, well, they're significantly different than from phosphates in that there is a phosphorus hydrogen stretch, and that's an important part of how we characterize them. And then because the Center for Chemical Evolution was really interested in early earth chemistry, we had to consider phosphate minerals. And this was a tough challenge. Phosphates are insulators, so they are not going to reflect infrared light. And so we spent some time and worked with a colleague of mine, Altu Pueras, who's an inorganic synthetic chemist who does a lot of electrochemistry. And so I had a master's student who worked with him to create thin films of hydroxyapatite. They had to be less than 25 microns in thickness in order for us to be able to do the infrared reflection technique that we use. This picture here in the center of this gold covered surface, you can see that the film is not totally uniform, but it is mostly covering the surface. And we were using a liquid solid interface. So this photo's polarization modulated, infrared reflection absorption spectroscopy. So when we started my lab, the thing that I was most interested in was understanding Schreiber site chemistry. And we looked at water, methanol, and formic acid as prebiotic molecules absorbed as ices. And unfortunately, what we saw was basically that it looked like these things were just interacting with the metal atoms on the surface. These looked like thick ices. There wasn't any interesting phosphorus chemistry involved. The Center for Chemical Evolution was not particularly interested in ices on Schreiber site because that wasn't particularly relevant to the early Earth. And when we didn't see activation of the phosphorus, we moved on to this hydroxyapatite system. And there were some experiments coming out of other groups within the center that were showing that urea, ammonium formate, and water mixtures actually were able to dissolve phosphate minerals basically and give you some phosphorylation chemistry. And so we were trying to understand how the phosphate films were interacting with the eutectic UAFW. While we got very complex spectra that we could mostly assign the features for, it wasn't entirely obvious how the film was really being solubilized. Although we were able in NMR to confirm that in fact, in the presence of the UAFW, you can get phosphate released into solution. That doesn't happen with just a urea and water or an ammonium formate and water mixture. Well, to some extent, with ammonium formate and water, it does. You can see this feature that's slightly shifted around 0.5 to 1 ppm. So it does seem like the ammonium formate is pretty important in terms of getting the release of the phosphorus. And that was primarily where we left that project. And then we went to look at these metal phosphites as an alternative to phosphates on the early Earth. What was nice about these is that the pH stretch makes it fairly easy to confirm that you've synthesized the substance that you're interested in using either infrared, which is on the left, or Raman in the middle, or NMR on the right. So that phosphorus hydrogen bond is really key for identifying these. And we started to be able to look at some of the chemistry related to these phosphites. In particular, we wanted to know why they weren't observed in the geological record. And we were able to show that there's a problem of oxidation. So even if phosphites were prevalent on the early Earth, they're probably not going to persist in the rock record because they oxidize fairly easily and will also polymerize. And so this makes it hard to say definitively or to go back and basically be able to find evidence of phosphites as phosphites in the rock record. However, working on metal phosphites helped us understand some of our previous Schreiber site experiments a little better. And what we noticed was that that pH stretch in the phosphite was actually showing up if we were oxidizing the Schreiber site sample. And I don't have a slide for it here, but there's been a recent publication of a theoretical group that really showed that it is likely that if you have water multi-layers on Schreiber site, the first thing you'll do is basically get phosphite formation on the surface, and eventually that can become phosphate on the surface. So very recently, my students have been looking at trying to deposit water and methanol ices and look for the pH stretch. And we were very excited when we first saw a feature but you might notice that it's not popping up at exactly the right wavelength. So this 2345 peak is probably CO2 ice. And we are currently in the process of trying to determine if that's contamination from the Schreiber site surface that's seeping through the ices, or if it is background contamination, likely from, small amounts of oil vapor in the background of our chamber. But we can see it in both the water ice experiments where there is no carbon source, so it's got to be coming from background contamination. And we see it in our methanol experiments, where we sort of expected to see the formation of CO2 as a decomposition product of methanol. We do confirm in the QMS that there is methanol evolving off of the surface. And the cracking pattern that we see in the QMS is very similar to what we see if we just backfill the chamber with methanol. So there's probably some level of decomposition, but likely a lot of this is just methanol dissolving from the surface. So in terms of our research takeaways, my lab has developed pretty robust methods for making a variety of phosphorus-containing minerals, and we've done some reactivity measurements, but there's still a lot that could be done in this area, especially if we're trying to understand sources of phosphorus in the interstellar medium or circumstellar envelopes. There's some really interesting observational data from the last 5 years that I think there's opportunity to try to explain. It does seem like metal phosphites are likely a key intermediate between meteoritic phosphides like schreibersite and the biological or closer to biological minerals of hydroxyapatites. And there are some calculations that are coming out that are really exciting for this. And I think those are going to be very important for understanding the laboratory results. I have a number of collaborators that I've worked with over the years, but these are 3 that I'm working with more recently. And I will point out that Donna Kassem was actually my first master's student who collected the initial Schreiber site data, and now she's a staff scientist at SWIRI, and we are working on some projects related to radiated ice and methanol, or water and methanol ice films on Schreiber site together. And I have a couple of undergraduates and a master's student in my lab who will be finishing up this spring his thesis. I've had a lot of research assistants over the years. This is not all the students I've worked with. These are just all the students who have participated in one of these phosphorus-bearing mineral projects. But actually, I did have an ACS PRF. And so I had a whole nother line of research in my lab that was looking at methane dissociation for a while. And so as a faculty member, I have, had some success in all 3 areas of my workload, right? I've published papers, I've delivered a lot of presentations, I've taught students in the classroom and trained research students, and I'm really proud of that work. The fact that I've been recognized for my professional service means I've done too much professional service, and I'm happy to talk to you about how you should try to manage that, because it can be quite the time commitment. But despite these, successes that I've really enjoyed, there have been challenges, right? And sometimes they say challenges happen in 3s, and 2020 was a tough year for me. The Center for Chemical Evolution sunsetted at the same time that I became a single mother. And then there was a global pandemic, and that trifecta really made it difficult to achieve the level of research success in my laboratory that I felt was necessary to keep me advancing in my faculty line. And so I decided that I have a really diverse research background. I've worked with a lot of people in different STEM disciplines, and I understand and can communicate pretty effectively about different kinds of science. And I am one of the more knowledgeable people at my institution about different kinds of funding opportunities. And so I approached the Office of Research at KSU back in 2020, 2021, and asked about opportunities. And so it started out with me mentoring the Summer Research Fellows Program, which is a summer program that we sponsor where we help faculty develop like their first big federal research grant, or if they're mid-career faculty, sometimes we're helping them figure out how to shift their project and write, a grant for someplace like NASA or NSF or NIH to get a big pot of money to be able to really launch into a new project. And I did that for a couple of summers, and then I was invited to come into research development and strategic initiatives as the interim director when the previous director left. And I will be transitioning into this full-time in May. And so we're supporting, the PI Academy is really about helping new faculty find funding opportunities and develop their research agendas. I do a variety of grant writing workshops. I've created an online course that has a lot of resources to step faculty through from the generation of idea and finding a funding mechanism all the way to getting all the supporting documentations for your grant proposal out there, and having some access to example proposals from faculty at our university. I run our internal seed funding programs through the Office of Research. I do a lot of interdisciplinary networking events and helping foster interdisciplinary collaborative projects on campus. And I'm happy to share insight and answer questions that y'all might have about how you can think about your career, or how you can think about funding your research agendas when you get to a point where you're the person in charge of bringing in the money. And I also encourage, I've talked a lot about academic positions, but I would encourage the organizing committee to think about bringing in someone from a NASA lab to talk about what it's like to pursue a career path in that direction, or someone from industry to speak about, what's it like to work for SpaceX if you want to do that. But I will stop talking now and take questions if there are any.
Thank you for that excellent talk. That was really great and really informative. As you just said, we do have plenty of time for questions. We have about 10 minutes at least. And so if people have questions, please do add them in the Q&A portion, or if you raise your hand, we can also let you unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just want to emphasize that, you're welcome to ask questions verbally. The way this works is you would need to raise your hand, and then we will give you the ability to access your microphone. But yeah, we do actually have a question that came in about halfway through the talk from an anonymous attendee who asks, Heather, your PhD to postdoc 1 to postdoc 2 were big jumps in fields. Can you please give some suggestion on finding a postdoc or getting a postdoc outside of the field in which you did your PhD?
Yeah, so you need to cast a wide net. The first time I was looking for postdoctoral positions, I think I emailed about 30 faculty, and it was split between, well, not faculty, PIs, because I was looking at positions in, postdocs within academic research groups, postdoc positions at national labs. And it was interesting. I applied for both theoretical and experimental positions. And some people just ignored me, right? Like maybe half of the emails I sent, I either got like a 1-word or 1-sentence response, or they just didn't ever respond. But I did have a few people who reached out. I had a very honest person who has an experimental group at PNNL who reached out and was like, "You look, you're clearly good, and I might be interested in you, but you're a theorist, and I'm doing supersonic molecular beam experiments, and I got a stack of applications for postdoc positions for people who actually have experience doing those measurements, right? So I'm not going to hire you." But it was interesting because then he also gave me the name of a bunch of people that he thought might hire me. And so part of it is just being willing to ask, even if it seems like it might not work out. I did my first postdoc with Hayo Freund, and he told me no, but left me an opening at first. So he wrote back and he was like, "Oh, I don't do any theory anymore. I don't have a habilitant who does that anymore. But good luck to you." And I wrote back and I said, "Well, I don't actually want to do theory. I want to work in one of these 2-3 experimental groups, and I'd love to talk to you about why I think it would be a good fit." And then he wrote back and he was like, "Okay, if you can find a plane ticket to Germany for under this price, you can come visit my research group and see." And so I found one. I had to stay in Germany for like a week, but I flew on Super Bowl Sunday to Germany. And I gave a really good job talk. And I was like, I am willing to work. I'm a hard worker. I am really good at communicating. I can work with a lot of different people. And, you know, I was an American, and so I qualified for this postdoctoral fellowship. And he was like, all right, you write a proposal for the fellowship. I guarantee you I'll pay you for 1 year. And if you get the fellowship, then you can stay for 2 and they'll pay you. And I got really lucky. You know, I wrote a good proposal and he supported me and it worked out. But if I had been too afraid to ask, then that would never have been an opportunity, right? So I think you have to be willing to put yourself out there and accept the rejection, right? Like not everybody's going to want to work with you, and that's okay. I think it is also important to make sure you leverage the skills that you have. The person you're trying to work with has to see that they're going to get something out of it. You know, the best postdoc positions are ones in which you're going to learn something new, but also be able to contribute. And that was what I did to get the position at Georgia Tech. The fact that I had a theoretical background was really interesting to them, to Tom Orlando especially. I had a lot of experience working with Mathematica, and he had code that a previous student had developed that no one else in his group could use. And so the trade-off was, I'm going to come learn laser systems. I'm going to write proposals because I'm interested in learning that skill. And that was good for him, right? It was good for him to have somebody else helping write proposals. And in exchange, I will also do this theory work for you. So sort of think about, if you want to try to transition, what you have that you can leverage, and how it can be a win-win for you and your potential postdoc advisor.
Thank you. That was really insightful.
What other questions do you have?
Heather, this is
Yes.
Dave. Can you tell us about your early experiences submitting grant proposals? Did you do well at the beginning, or did you struggle a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm probably not the best example. I got really lucky. I had a pretty good idea about where I was likely to have success. And so my first few submissions all hit on the first try. And I will say that that's not very common. I've had some, you know, I haven't submitted a single PI award to an external funding agency because it hasn't really made sense. So I've always been, well, I shouldn't say that. I did for the first 2. So the early career ones I got just for Kennesaw State, but those were also early career and foundation awards, and they have higher success rates. And I was really strategic, and I think I was able to be really successful. And then I sort of looked at the federal funding landscape and thought, there's no chance that I'm going to be able to convince a panel that at a place like Kennesaw State, I'm going to do a big project on my own, which is why being part of the Center for Chemical Evolution was so helpful. But then I've had a couple of different proposals that I've wrote in collaboration with Matt Pasek, and they've had varying levels of success. I've written some with Donna Kassem. I think that for me, I felt like it was a much better sell if I was part of a team as opposed to a single PI. That being said, I do a lot of revision with faculty on proposals, and those have been really successful. So I think I'm maybe better at giving advice than I am at initiating proposals, but that's one of the things I really like in my job is, you know, it is hard to get it the first time. And you shouldn't be afraid of writing a proposal and not having it be funded. But also, if you can do it earlier and if you can get feedback, that's really important. I've served on several review panels, and that's really helped me be able to work with other faculty and helping them develop proposals that have been really successful.
Thanks, Heather.
Yeah.
So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
How much teaching experience did you gather while you were like a PhD student or teacher?
That's a great question. So I was never the instructor of record. So I TA'd a PChem class, like a lecture class, and led recitation sessions, which was good teaching experience. And I had gotten a teaching award, like a graduate research, a GTA award for that, which helped on my resume. One of the things I did during my postdoc at Georgia Tech was I attended a lot of teaching workshops that were held by the Center for Education, Teaching, and Learning, and most universities have something like that. I will say that one of the guys on the search committee at Kennesaw was a chemical education was his research area. And after about a month of being at KSU, I came to him and I was like, I'm really struggling. And he was like, well, you've taught a class before. And I said, no, I haven't. I've never been the instructor of record before. And so he was shocked because the way I wrote my teaching philosophy, I knew so much about pedagogy and I talked so much about classroom procedures and planning and stuff that they didn't actually realize that I had never been the instructor of record. So teaching experience is important, but you can do your homework and have a good perspective on what you're going to do in the classroom. Man, if anybody wants assistance with that too, I will also say I'm happy to share all of my general chemistry notes with anyone who wants them. I have really detailed lesson plans. I have tons of worksheets. I will give them to you for free. So y'all can, I'll put my email address in the chat, and anyone who wants it, I'll share my Dropbox because I've spent years developing them and also in collaboration with faculty at KSU. I love teaching. It is the thing that is the hardest about transitioning into this position in the Office of Research is that I can still adjunct teach, but I won't be, teaching a class as regularly. I have finally gotten to a point where my student evaluations are all really good. So now I'm walking away. I'm going to do something else that's challenging.
Thank you so much. That was really good.
Yeah.
We are at time, but if anybody has any, like a last minute, one more question, we could maybe take that. But if not, maybe let's thank Heather again and thank you all for coming. It was very, I found it a very helpful talk and discussion. Yeah.
Well, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer questions, or I can give a talk on grant writing if you want. NASA 101. Although you should also ask your PIs. They have good experience.
Right. Probably close it then.